there are many books to study the nature of authoritarianism and how the police could be mythologized, seen as heroes following the law, but taking away human rights at the same time. And this is it. Judge Dredd. The complete case files. And what a beautiful thing. I'm old enough that when the first comics came out, 2000 AD, I got them. And Judge Dredd wasn't the only character in there, but over the years we were introduced to him. He developed his character. And what they've done is a load of books like this. And they're really big. Crammed full of the original series. And how he's developed over time. At first we didn't have Anderson. There wasn't Judge Death. So these are not the annuals, which I collected, I think the first 10 or 12 annuals that were done much bigger in the 1980s, 90s. Meet the toughest lawman of them all, Judge Dredd. And how the very look of him changed. So that by the time we get to his return to Mega City, he's much more resplendent in gold and stuff. There's quite a lot of these books. And I just thought, wow, this is definitely something I've got to get back into. If I remember, it was a Spaniard, I can never remember his name, Esquerra or something, who did the original artwork. Carlos Esquerra. And how, or what it tells us of one, the 1970s, when these particular episodes were done. What was it looking back to? What was it imagining or reimagining? What does it tell us now? And how Judge Dredd, especially when he goes into the wasteland, how his character develops, if at all. Joe. And the slow reveal of all the characters around him and the mega cities and all the weird names of the blocks. I'm sure there was a Gary Glitter block, but I might be reimagining that or imagining it. And the corruption that seeps into the organisation that's behind him. And then you get these fantastic standalones where there's Emperor Lard and... oh, just brilliant. The world building overall is just fantastic. So this is just an introduction of the first book. A great collection pieces. I love such artwork. And there's other books, of course. They would eventually become colorized. But, yeah. So the original artist of Judge Dredd was a Catalonian, Carlos Ezquerra. He came from Barcelona. He got out of Spain probably in the early to mid-70s. When he died, when he passed away in 2018, the Guardian newspaper did an article on him because he came to influence a whole generation, including myself. And the article read, "Fascist Spain meets British punk, the subversive genius of Judge Dredd," by Ian Dunt. Well, there's two key words, fascist and subversive. And it says, "It's a mark of honour for the British comic book industry that its most instantly recognisable icon is also its most subversive. That achievement is down in great part to Carlos Ezquerra. Ezquerra started his career drawing war comics in Barcelona, and the war element, I mean, Dredd is just a one-man wrecking crew of war, really. He's one of these, like, Boyzone comics where the hero rushes alone to get rid of a sniper nest or whatever, rushing into the fray. He wrote such comics, he penned them in Barcelona before moving to the UK and working for 2000 AD and others. He brought the iconography of fascist Spain to Dredd's extremely weird and vivid design, and he combined it with his experiences of living in Croydon in London through the 70s and 80s punk movement, which was on his doorstep, and TV images of policemen charging strikers. So black, which obviously is a fascist colour, from the black shirts of Mussolini to the SS Schutzstaffeln of the Nazis in Germany. It wasn't pure black, but the Civil Guard, the black-hatted policemen of Spain, were well known to British tourists, even after the fall of, or the end of Franco's Spain. So the eagle motif and helmet from fascist Spain. They talk here about the drawn truncheon from police on the picket line. It's more a gun, the lawgiver. And the chains and knee pads, which is from punk. Yeah, you can see that. And he said, this is Ezquerra, I was living in Franco's Spain, but also I was living in Mrs. Thatcher's England. So Franco's Spain. We know that Nazism died with the death of Hitler and the fall of Nazi Germany, 1945, and likewise Italy before that. But fascism carried on in Spain until the early 70s. Ezquerra grew up with that, and therefore was very marked, or it had an effect on him. It literally seeped into the way he draws, and I'll go through the artwork in a moment. Mrs. Thatcher was seen as a great, if not divisive, force in British politics. She literally would not negotiate with miners who were losing their jobs, and the industry was collapsing in Britain, the coal was running out. She also brought in, towards the end of her tenure, the dreaded poll tax that caused riots. We see the change in what a lot of people look back, perhaps too fondly, and think it's more of a community-minded 1970s, but by the end of Thatcher's reign, it had become me rather than we. It was the cult of greed, yuppies as they were called, and it caused a lot of angst in that really overthrowing of a previous generation's view on what Britain was. That's what the artist wanted to do. It's a warning. This is what happened in Europe. This is what happened in his homeland. And he's saying to the British audience, although it's set in America, it's the Anglo-Saxon audience, this can happen to you. And bear in mind, this is 1977. He talks about, through the likes of Dredd, the escalation where the police become a permanent military force with huge weaponry, and he will arbitrarily go round, and no doubt he'll know the law offhand. I mean, it's said in one of the episodes, and we don't get much character building with Dredd at first. That comes much later. But one of the early episodes, we see him relaxing at home. And why is it when you want to find anything, you never can? There we are. One thing we learn about Joe Dredd, slowly, is that even in his downtime, he doesn't relax. He never takes his helmet off, which is when Sylvester Stallone portrayed him in the early 90s movie, upset a lot of people because he takes his helmet off. Carl Urban doesn't do that in the reprise. He studies his books, he never relaxes. And he's following the law, but he does it in such a way that he will not gather evidence, he will not speak to witnesses. And as I went through this, I thought, it's not as I remember it. And I thought, well, that must be memory then. Memory does play strange tales in our heads, doesn't it? But I looked at the back, and as bonus material, it's actually got the thing I do remember. It's the first episode. That wonderful picture there. Now that alone, as I've now having studied art and art history. So in fascist Italy, what became a cult was the cult of artwork that would show weaponry and speed as being great. Machismo. It was the glorification of war. Well, that would fit in very well with fascist ideology artwork. But I remember that imagery, and I remember one right at the end of the story. As a 13-year-old boy, back in the late 70s, I remember it. And it's this lone Judge Dredd, dwarfed by Mega City 1, and saying, I am the law and you'd better believe it. I've never forgotten it. But I never picked up the idea that this was a warning. that this is Carlos Oezquera and others, Bolland, who took over, saying, beware authority. This is where we could slide into very easily. So what is Judge Dredd about? You don't get it at the beginning. I guess I'm kind of layering on now stuff that over the years I've picked up as I read through Judge Dredd as a child and a young man. I used to collect, as I said, the albums, but I've got to think it's 30 odd years ago now. I think it hypothesizes that in the late 2000s, because it's set in 2099 and beyond. In fact, this says here it's 2099 to 2100, the years. There's a huge nuclear war, and it decimates large parts of the planet. By then, we have a colony on the moon and whatever. But America, the whole continent of North America, is destroyed. It becomes a mutant wasteland. And the world building there and in the big cities that remain, the mega cities, is really well done. So the whole eastern seaboard of the United States become one city. It's called Mega City 1. It's full of millions and millions of people who have survived. And they generally live in these huge tenement blocks, which in this first one in this case file is wonderfully laid out as star scrapers. They're not skyscrapers. This here is the Empire State Building, which is a skyscraper, but these go much taller to the stars, hence star scrapers. And look at the difference in the artwork. Empire State Building, straight lines as we've come to know. But these are almost organic, strange shapes to them. Wonderful. And you've got these highways in which traffic goes anything up to 200, 250 kilometers an hour with no guardrails. Imagine that. And therefore, what has happened is that the people who survived have set up a thing called the judge system. It says here, judges are special lawmen of the 21st century. They are elected by the people to enforce the law. But they enforce the law in a very brutal, fascistic manner. And the reason being is that they're not doing a very good job. Every episode, or in this case, every case, criminals are going amok, and they all believe that they can outsmart. Generally, the motive is they can outsmart the judges. A lot of them do it because they want to get Judge Dredd. A lot of them want to kill him or best him, and they don't. So it's very black and white. So Judge Dredd turns up on his bike. The Lawmaster, it's computerized, which in 1970 was an unheard thing. It was fantastic. It's criminals who are trying to rob or maim or whatever. And then that hero, Dredd, comes along, and generally on his own, he goes off and he confronts the criminals and he deals with them. But he'll often take them outside of the scene where we've just seen something happen. It could be in a bank or a vault. And as I say, right here, this bit, it says, I find you guilty of bank robbery and murder and hereby terminate you. And if somebody, could be an innocent bystander, gets out of the way, but happens to put a foot off the sidewalk, and Judge Dredd sees it, and invariably does, they're carted off to isolation cubes for years. It's just that kind of over-the-top, black, comedic, almost a tragedy. And what does it tell us about society? Well, it tells us a lot about how Oezquera saw it, but why was it popular? Why did I and a whole generation love this kind of work? What's it telling us now? Can we recognize in this a future? And what's interesting, there's a lot of commentary on... This is the problem, it's back to front. There's a lot of commentary on society. They're living in these huge towers, and I'm sure one of them was called Gary Glitterblock. Amazing. You have to be British to know that. Get the reference. But they're in these huge blocks, and they're generally without work, and they're bored. They're kept almost like cattle. And so they get these weird ideas of what society should be. And we see this explored over the history of Judge Dredd. where you get people thinking, right, what's beautiful then? Well, let's add a wart here and there, or disfigure ourselves deliberately, because that is the new beauty standard. And in the 1970s, there was no real cosmetic surgery, not like it is now. There's no Botox. And it almost put up a mirror to society and said, look, this is where the craziness can take you. And you get a thing called the fatties, the lardies, who are under Emperor lard, and they're just overeating themselves, because back in the 70s, that tended not to happen. This guy is a criminal, and he knows that his face is going to be recognised by the ever-watching cameras. Therefore, he goes to a franchise called The New You to have his face changed. It takes 20 minutes. Amazing prescience. And again, it's the daring do, the over-the-top action. Here's Dredd. He's chasing this car. He jumps off his bike onto the roof, shoots through the roof, causes the fleeing criminal to veer off the road, and then he's arrested. What I loved with the word building was the mutants outside, strange things that we come across. That always appealed to me. And there was a offshoot one called Strontium Dog, which is very similar. So fantastic ideas, very well done, very amusing. And how he rounds up some of the criminals and deals with them, because it has to be different each one, is amazing. It's the creativity is really, really good. But again, something I never picked up on, and it's this warning about overreach of authority. Those lanes with those cars, they're all going at 250 miles an hour. Prisoners are put on islands and left to themselves. They can't get off because of the sheer traffic. If they jumped off, they're instantly dead. What does that say? Because they do say you can judge a society by the way it looks after its old and its vulnerable. And its prisoners. Not very well in this case. And it says these people were voted in. In the beginning was the law. He is judge, jury, and executioner, a merciless, far future lawman, delivering justice with an iron fist on the mean streets of Megacity 1. He is Judge Dredd. Dreadful. You either look at this, a young boy, a young man who loved that world building, couldn't get enough of it, and then collected it, read it, consumed it. Only now am I mindful of the fact, you are what you consume. And having served in the forces, and having hooked up with an old mate of mine who has spent 3-4 decades as a policeman, and just speaking to him how, that slow erosion, possible slow slide in which the state begins to control every facet of things. Are we heading the same way? I think that is what Ezquerra wanted to put across. Whether he did it deliberately, subconsciously at first, who knows? And again, I'm always mindful of the likes of Tolkien, who said, don't read too much into The Lord of the Rings. Are we reading? Am I reading too much into this? Well, not according to what The Guardian says, but also what you read. This is a deliberate showing of a group of people who decide whether you're going to live or die, and there ain't nothing you can do about it. One of the great novels ever written is a graphic novel, in my opinion. It's called The Watchmen. And it shows this group of caped crusaders who set out to defend democracy or whatever. And it asks the question, if they're the Watchmen, who watches the Watchmen? What happens when police or detectives or paramilitaries go rogue? And I think that's something that people are very conscious of right now. If this was reinvented and reissued now, I wonder how it would be interpreted and what would be shown. But more importantly, whether we've become immune to it. This was fairly innocuous at the time. I remember another magazine came out called Action, and that was pretty brutal. Far brutal than this. That was considered too brutal at the time, but this wasn't. So it just flew slightly under the radar as far as most people are concerned. Kids loved it. But I think perhaps a lot of adults thought it was just a pastiche, it's just a comedy, you know, never going to happen. I'm not sure now most people would think that. I think a lot of people could think, yeah, all right, perhaps Carlos, he had something here, perhaps he was correct. But there you go. Wonderful to read and to consider those things that I've just highlighted. I don't know whether you personally have ever read it or are interested in such stuff. Just as a final note, I think the reason this is very powerful, not just because historically I read it in the past and I remember a lot of it, I think it's the equivalency of a stand-up comedian. Often, the only way a culture can criticize those in control is through stand-up comedy. It's seen as a laugh. It makes you laugh. Oh, yeah, how stupid are we to follow all that and da-da-da-da-da. But it's telling often quite disturbing truths. Especially if you listen to the likes of Frankie Boyle and whatever. This is similar. Cartoons, for their childlike look, often paint a picture of a society that's gone awry, and often is overlooked because they're only comics. It's a way in which, as I said before, it's saying something about the society at the time. But there you go. I think that's why it's powerful. It's just a unique medium in its own right. Judge Dredd. Ta-ta for now.